Welcome back to History Class with Dr. W. We're continuing our discussion of diplomacy between the wars. And in this lecture, we're going to talk about the mid-1930s, a period in which the United States continued to try to stick with its long-standing policies of neutrality and isolation. It's almost impossible for us now to imagine a world in which the United States is uninvolved in affairs of the rest of the world, remaining neutral. And in some ways, these years in the mid-1930s are the last period in which the United States actually did try to remain neutral and isolated. As we'll see, their efforts at neutrality are strained and ultimately snap by the late 1930s, as the affairs of the rest of the world became far too pressing and important for the United States to remain uninvolved. In the mid-1930s, Americans who were so inclined could rise early in the morning, 4 or 5 o'clock, and tune in their radios to listen to a voice coming from across the ocean. It was an imposing, powerful, charismatic voice, the voice of Adolf Hitler. Hitler came to power in Germany in the same year that FDR did in the United States, 1933. He faced similar problems, too, as Germany was mired in a deep economic depression. And like FDR, Hitler faced those problems heroically and helped lift his nation from depression. But there were, of course, major differences between the two. Hitler was obsessed with several things. He was obsessed with power and with death. It's said that when he entered the chamber of the Reichschancellery, the German equivalent of the White House, he said, "There's only one way I'll leave this building, as a corpse." He was also obsessed with avenging Germany's defeat from World War I. As he wrote in his biography, Mein Kampf, My Struggle, he said, "I turned to the wall of my room and cried, and I vowed that I would avenge Germany." He was also obsessed with the purity of the German race, an issue that we'll discuss much more later in the course. It was said by some that if Hitler had died in 1938, he would be remembered as one of the greatest, perhaps the greatest, German statesmen of all time. He was voted Man of the Year by Time magazine in 1936. And the 1936 Berlin Olympics were viewed by many around the world as a triumph for the new German regime. So like FDR, Hitler dug his nation out from the depths of the Depression. There were some similarities but differences in the approach. Like FDR, he put the German people back to work. But in Germany, much of that work was geared to military preparedness and building. He was creating a military machine. And by the mid-1930s, he had begun to deploy that military machine. The advance had begun. In 1936, Germany reoccupied the Rhineland, which was a strip of land taken by France as part of the Versailles Treaty after World War I. In 1938, Germany took Austria and joined with it. Now they completely surrounded part of Czechoslovakia. So Hitler sat down with leaders of the Allied nations. They agreed to let him have the Sudetenland, which was part of Czechoslovakia. He swore that was the last of his conquests. He lied. By 1939, he took the rest of Czechoslovakia. And in September of 1939, his conquest continued when he launched the invasion of Poland. On September 1st, 1939, the Germans invaded Poland, and 27 days later, Poland fell. Next came the Blitzkrieg from April through June of 1940. Germany invaded and conquered Denmark, Norway, Luxembourg, Belgium, and finally France, which surrendered on June 22nd. All that remained was to conquer Great Britain, even if it survived mostly by luck at that point, as some 330,000 British forces miraculously escaped from the little French port town of Dunkirk, paddling across the English Channel in any kind of boat they could find. So the point of all of this is that now the United States is observing and viewing this conquest from across the ocean. And the questions begin to arise. What should or what will the United States do about any of this? So we'll come back and talk more in some detail about these wartime aggressions by Germany. For the moment, we're going to focus on American response to them. It wasn't only the rise of Hitler and German aggression that challenged American neutrality in the mid-1930s. In Italy, the fascist dictator Mussolini rose to power in 1935. He fancied Italy a great power, which it really wasn't, and he wanted to revive the great tradition of the ancient Roman Empire. He was obsessed with ancient and early Italian history. As part of this goal, he launched an attack on Ethiopia, a relatively small and weak African nation. The League of Nations, England, and other nations didn't like this act of aggression, but they really didn't do anything to try to stop it. The calls came out from Ethiopia to the rest of the world, help us, and yet no one intervened, including the United States as well. And some were worried that responding an aggression against Italy might lead them into war with Germany, as those two nations were clearly growing closer to each other. In 1936, in Spain, the fascist leader Francisco Franco launched a revolution, which ultimately would be successful. But the revolution drew much attention in the United States, and many Americans, including Ernest Hemingway, actually went to Spain to defend the falling democratic government. So, at the government level, though, what is the response of the United States to these acts of aggression around the world? Well, the United States passed a series of neutrality acts in 1935, 36, and 37 as a statement to the rest of the world and an attempt to remain uninvolved in these growing global crises. The 1935 Neutrality Act, primarily in response to Mussolini and the invasion of Ethiopia, stated that the president can prohibit arms shipments to belligerent nations, and also that American citizens traveled on ships to belligerent nations at their own risk. In 1936, another Neutrality Act extended these actions to economic activity, that we would not extend credit or loans to belligerent nations. And finally, the 1937 Neutrality Act declared that nations engaged in civil war would also be treated as belligerents, this primarily in response to the Spanish Civil War. It introduced the idea of cash and carry, that the United States might sell goods but not munitions on a cash and carry basis. That is, if nations could come and pick up their goods, the United States might sell them things that they needed. But all of these ideas reiterated the thought that the United States was going to be uninvolved and remain neutral in these kind of global affairs. But even as we're trying to remain neutral, affairs were heating up once again on the other side of the world, with Japan and China, which in 1937 went to war once again. In Chicago in 1937, FDR gave his famous quarantine speech, which said that we should quarantine aggressor nations just as we would quarantine a person afflicted with a contagious disease. We quarantine aggression and violence so it won't infect everyone else. But he never really clarifies what exactly he means by this. How do you quarantine an entire nation? But this was just another way of underscoring the policy of neutrality and isolation. We weren't actively going to get involved beyond trying to cut off and isolate Japan from the rest of the world. But in 1937, American neutrality was put to its toughest test yet, again by Japan, when it sank the United States gunboat, the Panay, on the Yangtze River. It's pretty clear now in hindsight that Japan bombed the boat intentionally, though at the time they claimed it was an accident. The United States didn't want to get involved in a war, and so they accepted Japan's sort of flimsy apology and explanations for the attack. By the late 1930s, the American government, and in some ways its citizens, were continuing to express a commitment to the idea of isolation. In 1938, the Ludlow Resolution, which never passed, was debated in Congress. It was a constitutional amendment requiring a national referendum before the United States could go to war. Imagine if we had to have a national vote before going to war. It didn't pass, but it was close. Also in 1938, a group of students took the famous Oxford Pledge that they would never bear arms in a war. And 8 Princeton undergrads formed the Veterans of Future Wars, demanding bonuses before they even went to war. Now, obviously, this is something of a student prank and shouldn't be taken entirely seriously. But it was just one of many of these kind of statements coming from all around the country that the nation wanted neutralities. We've passed a series of neutrality acts, and we've gone to great lengths to stay out of war. But in 1940 and 41, the pressure to go to war would become so much greater, and eventually American commitment to isolation and neutrality was not only strained, but broken.